Hello and welcome back, and if you haven't watched the first two, you know the drill by now, but for those who might not know, this is the third part of the ranking of a bunch of analog horror series, and if you want to know where we left off, then I would highly recommend going back and checking out the other two videos. This is directly related to the other two, and you will miss out if you don't watch the other two for context. But with all that being said, let's begin. So I've actually made a whole video on this analog horror video before, but for those who might not know about it, this video has got to be one of the scariest videos on YouTube at this moment. It follows someone exploring their family home after a huge storm blows through, flooding everything and ruining the house completely. And the video seems to have the protagonist stuck in some sort of time loop where each time he goes through the house it just gets worse and worse. Generally, with most people, the plot's understood as being a man who died in his family home during a storm, stuck in limbo as his family home rots around him. It's a horrifying idea, and the short does an excellent execution of the concept and is just frightening all around. Every single time our protagonist seems to go into another room, it just gets worse and worse, and the sound design really puts you on edge, so it makes you think that there's going to be some huge scare, but where the genius of this comes from is that there is none. It has you on edge and keeps you on the edge of your seat the whole time, but the scare never comes. And that makes the feeling while watching this one just so brutal because the tension is so intense, but nothing ever comes from it. It's an amazing concept and it keeps your attention for the whole time, and the tension just beats you down relentlessly. It's a breath of fresh air from the horror that has become the most common at this time, which is just covered from head to toe in jump scares while lacking any atmosphere whatsoever. This almost seems to be the antithesis to modern horror, like a lot of Nana's other content. While it's not the most scary thing I've ever seen, it has me on edge for its entire runtime, which for horror should be admired. In an age where atmospheric pieces are more looked down upon and turn for cheap, easy scares, this short pushes back against that and turn for a frightening and exhilarating experience. And there really isn't any issues to look at here. The concept is easy to follow, the cinematography and effects do the job for what it's trying to convey, and the sound design is just wonderful. And that constant radio in the background has got to be one of the creepiest usages of a radio in an online horror short I have ever seen, as no matter where he goes in the house, he can hear it, and the constant chanting over the radio just adds a creepier, almost religious feeling to it. The only argument I can really see being thrown against this short in this video is that I don't know if it's exactly an analog horror short. It's more of a found footage short than anything else, but this is what the tier list said. I didn't choose which ones were on here, so don't blame the messenger. But with all that being said, with just how good this one is, I really cannot give it anything lower than an S tier. I really think this has got to be one of the best shorts on the entire platform. You have got to check this one out. However, the next one on this list has got to be the complete opposite of this one, which is of course Okay, so for me, this one was quite difficult to really find, as there seems to be two, with one of them being deleted by Paramount, which is of course the one by Beyond Birth, with the other being by Yuga's Hyper. But in all honesty, my opinions on both of these are about the same, and that is that both of these are terrible. Like really, what are we even doing here? South Park analog horror? Seriously? It reads like a parody, but here's the thing, it's not, which makes this one even funnier to me. Like, wow, this one is awful. Both of them are really the epitome of what I'm talking about when I describe lazy and uninteresting storytelling. And it's just sad, because this is once again just another terrible IP-based analog horror series that really doesn't add anything new to the table. It's seriously just another bad IP horror. It's not any good, the scares are more scary faces, the imagery is the least frightening it can possibly be, and also a lot of the horror from the series is possibly taken from other artists on DeviantArt without permission, but that's just what people are saying, who knows? And even without that, it's just a nothing series. There's nothing original to it, nothing new, nothing creative. And I really don't like the idea of calling a concept for a series bad as a whole, but really, who wanted this at all? South Park is a parody show, and trying to make it scary, while certainly being feasible, is just not really a good idea in the first place. This is why I honestly could not tell if this was some sort of strange shitpost, as the majority of the story is so cliche that it could honestly pass as one. I mean seriously, what level have we gotten to where the South Park analog horror is taken just as seriously as something like Greylock? This one is just terrible, and I really cannot give this anything higher than an F tier. This one is absolutely awful. Neither version of it are any good, and it's just annoying to see this being what analog horror has come to in recent months. I mean, seriously, what were they even thinking with this one? It's just a nothing series, which is somewhat similar to the next one, which is of course So on the surface level, this one really isn't anything that special, a retelling of creepypastas in the analog horror format. Similar to Chainmail Chasers and Vibing Leaf before it, this series follows a bunch of recreations of already famous creepypastas like Smile Dog and Ben Drown, and tries to make it into one cohesive series. But unlike Chainmail Chasers, this one goes for an almost completely derivative style of presentation, borrowing heavily from the styles of the other ones within the subgenre. And while this necessarily isn't a bad thing, the style and story of this one is just so derivative of the others before it that it really doesn't have much of a voice of its own. I mean, really think about it. When your presentation and story are ripped from other sources, then what is truly the real identity of your series? You cannot just borrow every single factor of your series and expect something truly original. And it's not like this series is blowing me away with each factor going forward in a way that could make me ignore the flaws. It's just another basic analog horror series, and there really isn't anything going for it. I mean, it lacks originality, the pacing is basic, the choices, while they make sense, they're not really there to make the story more interesting, and it's just another IP heavy series. It's not offensively bad, like a lot of the others that I've covered in the past, but however, it's just so basic that I really cannot say I found enjoyment or cared about what I was watching. And that honestly is just as bad as something that tried but failed, as I really would prefer to see something that pushed the genre forward and failed than something that didn't even try at all. And once again, the majority of it just feels lazy. It really doesn't do anything new or interesting, and instead just flatlines with each new episode. If I had to give it one thing, the imagery in certain spots can be quite effective, but the storytelling on display here really holds it back from truly being anything special. I could try and find something to praise here, but there really isn't anything noteworthy for me to talk about within the series. It's just too derivative and boring to really add anything of note to the medium, which is why I never covered it up to this point. And because of that, I really can't give this anything higher than a D tier, as while I don't think it's as bad as the ones in the F tier, it really doesn't have any saving graces like other derivative series like Basewood County with its artwork, which is the complete opposite of the next one, that of course being oh, thank goodness. I swore this video was about to be primarily clunkers, but this one is just so good. Greylock is a simple but effective series that aces almost every aspect of what makes analog horror just so effective. The presentation is great, getting the more scientific videos tape style down, and feels like a straightforward horror film at times. It's not just black backgrounds with white text. We see horrifying imagery combined with an intriguing story. And the story is fleshed out with actual characters to care about, which is something that to me doesn't seem that shocking, but this is one of the essentials that people seem to be forgetting about, especially, which is that if you're going to have a series instead of just a one-off, then you have to have interesting characters and stakes at play. Once again, this stuff seems super simple to do, but I don't see it that often, especially with stuff like the Little Red Riding Hood analog horror recently. It's a great and entertaining series, and it's just as effective as it was when it was released, with not many other analog horror series even trying to come up with the task of meeting it presentation-wise. Now that's not to say it's perfect, it still has some issues, mainly with the pacing of it feeling a bit slow at points, and the pacing then ramping up to the point where more happens in one episode than has happened in the past 5. Then there's the characters, which while having characters is definitely one of the pluses of this series, I really can't say I remembered nor care about any of them. A lot of what makes this series work is just the thought behind what could possibly be behind the mountain, and that's what keeps you intrigued rather than what happens to these people. Many of them are just fodder to be killed by the mutants coming out of the mountains. Thus, while I really like this series, I really can only give it a high A tier. Mind you, I still really liked the series, but those relatively minor issues kept me from enjoying it to the full possibility that I could. However, many of these issues I can still look over, that's why it's still a high A tier, which is really similar to the next one, which is of course The Walten Files is a solid series, I'll say it. When first looking at it, it just seems like another boring FNAF analog horror series, and honestly, it's still a bit of a FNAF ripoff, but what makes the Walten Files just so interesting is the story itself. Just like a lot of the other FNAF VHS analog horror series before it, it takes the basic concepts of the FNAF storyline and adds onto it, adding more character development and a fuller story. But unlike a lot of the other FNAF style ones, this one doesn't just stop at basic character development and instead adds a whole new layer of lore to it that makes the series that much more interesting and fascinating. I mean, really, some scenes in the series are quite frightening, if not downright heartbreaking. And for a series with a frankly meh art style, to see that storyline play out is really something that has to be watched. And while the art style isn't exactly my favorite thing, especially in the earlier ones, I think a lot of it boils down to the story being more fleshed out than a lot of the other ones that I covered. And hell, with the release of The Return of the Pumpkin Rabbit, I really don't think the art style is going to bother me much longer, with the art style in that one actually being something new and stylized. I just hope this series doesn't become one of those which is style over substance, and while the story is good, it really does take its time to actually get interesting, as with a lot of the series you can tell the creator of it is actively improving with each new episode. But because of the first few episodes not really being up to par with all the ones that came out after it, I really can't give it anything higher than an A tier. A lot of the newer ones definitely are closer to an S tier analog horror, but the other older ones I really would put closer to a B tier, and with considering the series as a whole, it averages out to about an A tier. But while the series changed a lot with time, the same really can't be said for the next one, that of course being This one is fairly simple as well as a fairly short concept. I had seen the meme template surrounding this one before seeing the actual short and was honestly surprised to find out it was actually an analog horror series. The imagery in this one is quite good and there's a lot of good ideas around it, with the drug unlocking new, mostly likely mutated emotions while keeping it ambiguous enough for your mind to wander about what these new emotions actually mean. I enjoyed that while the evil was revealed early, it still left it mostly ambiguous, as while it does give it a name, it doesn't explain much more besides the image, allowing your mind to wander trying to figure out what that emotion could possibly be and how dangerous it could be. It's a fairly simple story and there isn't much shown here, so there really isn't much to talk about. I think there could be a lot more here, and I find myself somewhat disappointed in the lack of substance, but hell, it really isn't meant to be much more than it is. So I think it's fair to give it a B tier. It's nothing super special, but I still really enjoyed watching it. This is, however, the complete opposite of the next one, that of course being Seriously, what am I even watching at this point? This is just another series with spooky faces and people being killed by a popular IP. It's a creepypasta tier story and just not a good series. I'm sorry. I really tried to give this one a fair shot, but seriously, what even is this? I mean, yeah, it's not an F tier, but my god, what is even the point of this one? It is quite literally just black backgrounds with white text and then a Godzilla with spooky eyes. This doesn't really add anything new to the subgenre to push it forward, it doesn't have an interesting story, and it doesn't really try anything new. It's just another nothing series, but at least the imagery on display here was made by an actual person and not just stolen from other series. And I really don't have anything else to say here besides it being a D tier, but at the very end of it, almost an F tier, just slightly more interesting than the ones in the F tier. And with all that being said, make sure if you enjoyed this video to like and subscribe to the channel, as I upload once a week, and I'll see you all next week.